Hi everyone. I'm waiting for people to start connecting. Hi Rita. I'm back with the live sessions. Hi. Yala, I'm just waiting for people to connect. Hello, hello. Hi Sidine. Hi Chloe. So guys, welcome to my live session today, and I'm very proud to have as a guest tonight Adel Afiouni. Adel Afiouni, as most of you know him, he's a former minister, and he was a former minister of technology and investment. Adel also has a huge experience in the financial sector. He spent more than 25 years in major international investment banks in Paris, New York, and London. Also, Adel was head of emerging markets in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa for Credit Suisse since 2014. He was also member of the board of he is member of the board of directors of Life Association. Adel is very active on Twitter. He shares a lot of insight on the economic situation in Lebanon. I highly suggest you follow him on Twitter and read his tweets on a daily basis. He also participated in several economic conferences in Lebanon and abroad. He's the author of several articles on the ways to deal with the economic crisis in Lebanon, the reform and growth. So now I introduced Adel. I'm going to add him to the conversation to start the talk. 1 second. Adel, I'm going to send you the invitation. So accept it so you can join us here. Hi again to everyone. We're going to start the talk now. Hi Adel, how are you? Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect. So, Adel, I was just introducing you to everyone. Yani, they all know you as a former Minister of State for Technology and Investment. I was telling everyone that you're not mainly in the political scene. You're actually an investment banker with more than 25-year experience in the investment banking sector. And today you're here with us to tell us more about the situation in Lebanon, to enlighten us, because we all have issues. يعني كلنا اليوم عنا كتير questions عادي مش فاهمين شو عم بيصير. عم نشوف الاكسشينج ريت عم بيتدهور نهار ولا الثاني. الحد الأدنى للأجور صار تحت $80. So I guess a lot of people have many questions to ask you today. And I'm going to start first with a personal question شوي. لأنه I'm curious to know, Adel, you were one of the few technocrats in the previous government. As an outsider, finding yourself in the middle of a government and the political arena, can you give us a quick perspective on how it feels to come from the private sector and more particularly from the diaspora and join the political, let's say, the political jungle in Lebanon? Can you give us quickly your perspective?
Sure. I mean, as you said, I actually wasn't in politics at all. I was really an investment banker and living abroad. Obviously, I was involved in Lebanon on a personal level and through associations like Life that you mentioned earlier. In a bit like stars got aligned, I was asked if I would be interested in joining the government. And it's always an honor and a duty in a way to serve one's country. And I figured maybe that's the right time where I could put my experience at the service of my country. Clearly, I expected it's going to be very challenging, but to be honest, I didn't expect it's going to be that challenging. It's very difficult coming from the private sector to be plunged effectively in the difficult and challenging environment of Lebanese politics and of the Lebanese private sector. We all talk about corruption, inefficiency, and sometimes lack of expertise. But when you're in the middle of the system trying to progress certain things, sometimes those obstacles can be very frustrating. I don't regret the experience, but I think it was a very challenging one. We had some ideas. I think there was some goodwill, or at least a lot of people had goodwill. At least on my side, I really was determined to try to make a difference. Unfortunately, it was too tough. I tried. I met some very inspiring people within the public administration, as well as within the sector that I was in charge of, which is the technology sector, which gave me a lot of hope for the future. But clearly, I think the system in itself is inept and very difficult to reform. And that's why we ended up resigning. And I was actually very happy that we resigned, because when you can deliver, I think the right outcome is to say, to acknowledge that, accept the accountability and the will of the people, and go back home, which is what we did.
Okay, thank you for your honesty, Adel, today. And talking about resignation, we saw two resignation of two main figures in the negotiation with the IMF lately. يعني شفنا ألان بيفاني وشفنا Henri Shaoul last week. Well, how do you perceive both resignations today? And does it add to the problem, and does it weaken our stance with the IMF today, our negotiation line?
I think, I mean, I have to say first that I know both Alain and Henri on a personal level. I've known them for years. They're both friends. One. Two, I actually don't necessarily agree with their views on the economic plan. But I have to say that they're both very competent and honest people who I think were trying their best to help the country. So it's a bit unfortunate that we're losing competent and honest people. Whether we agree with them or not is another matter again, but we need that type of caliber at the negotiation table. And I think it's a manifestation clearly of the struggle within the government and within the system to reform, to execute on plans and to progress in general. In particular, with regards to this process of negotiation with the IMF, and we'll talk about it in a bit, but I think it's very important. I think it's probably our only hope for an exit in the near term from the crisis. And it's clearly unfortunate that after almost 3 months of starting that negotiation with the IMF, not only the Lebanese front is not unified, not only we still haven't agreed on the Lebanese side on the figures, but actually we're seeing defections out of frustration or out of a lack of progress. So from the outside, if we look at that process, it's becoming pretty chaotic, unfortunately, at a time where the crisis requires us to be much more effective and to have a bigger sense of urgency.
Definitely, I agree with you. هلا اليوم صار في debate شوي لأنه I posted on the page what Alain Bifani said and why he resigned basically. في ناس that found him a hero. يعني في كتير ناس لقوه a hero today لألان بيفاني, whereas other people قالوا إنه لا عم بيتخلى عن مسؤوليته, ما هو صار له 20 سنة in the ministry as director general, and today إنه اليوم ترك هالمنصب على أضرب وقت. يعني أنت برأيك how do you perceive it? Do you perceive it as إنه اليوم تخلى عن مسؤوليته, أو اليوم he put even more pressure on the government to act and to take action?
As I said, I mean, I've known Alain for more than 30 years, effectively. I think he's an honest public servant who's worked hard within an almost impossible system. So I think he tried his best. He has the integrity and the competence. As I said, I may not always agree with his views, but that's a different matter. I think he was a great element and a big loss for the Lebanese government and for the negotiating team. It doesn't have to be black or white. I don't think we have to say he's a hero, or he's definitely not a traitor. I think he just reached a level where the crisis is super acute, where there is a high level of responsibility on everybody involved, and he probably realized that it's a dead end, which again, I think is very unfortunate. So we have to actually salute the fact that public servants now are willing to resign if they cannot deliver. I think that's a good behavior, irrespective of whether we agree or disagree with him.
Okay, yeah, I got your point. So if you were part today, you probably would have resigned as well if you were part of this government, or...
I think I've reached the conclusion that and I'm saying this in a very blunt and honest way, unless there is a strong critical mass within the government of reformist and like-minded people, we're not going to be able to progress. The system has become so inept, so inefficient, and so locked, and often driven by vested interests or political agendas, that it's very difficult to change without enough critical mass. So yes, one or two people on their own, probably it's a dead end. And to be honest, you become almost guilty by association, which is a very frustrating situation to find yourself in.
Definitely. I like the connotation guilty by association, makes sense a lot. Adel, now going back to the government plan and the banks. I want to talk هون يعني صار في كثير عم بيصير في كثير ديبيت على تحديد وتوزيع الخسائر اليوم. يعني عم نشوف انه عندنا كذا بلان، كنا عندنا الجفرمنت بلان وعندنا البلان تبع الابي ال، وكمان عم يحكوا بنمبرز جديد بالبارلمنت كمان شفناها اخر شيء. So اليوم انت which number is the most accurate in your opinion؟ يعني we don't know which number to follow. What are the real losses? Do you think that the government plan is a feasible plan?
So I'll give you my view, which I think I was vocal about. I think both plans have fundamental flaws, to be honest. And I'll go through this very quickly. One, I think the government plan, basically the government in this process has three hats, contrary to a lot of emerging market crises where the government is the borrower, but is facing creditor, which are either international investors or international institutions. In our case, which is almost unique, 90% of the creditors are Lebanese, either Lebanese banks or Lebanese banks, effectively Lebanese depositors. So in this process, the government has three hats. The first is the borrower. So as a borrower, obviously, he's incentivized to maximize the haircut, to reduce his future liability, reduce debt to GDP, and move on. But he has a second hat, which is actually he's facing creditors, which are his own banking system, the local banking system. And as we know, in all countries, we avoid systemic risk. We need to preserve the banking system. The government's duty, the second hat, effectively, is to preserve the banking system, because without a banking system, there's no economic growth or no economic recovery. I think on that, the plan didn't show enough details about how the government wants to preserve the banking system. And when I say banking system, I'm not talking shareholders. I'm talking banking system as in banks, the entities, the business, the employees, and obviously the depositors. And that's the third hat. In this process, the biggest loser, the one that stands to lose the most in this restructuring process, and we have to remind ourselves all the time, is really the Lebanese depositor. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of families, not just 1,000 or 2,000. So the third hat for the government is to also make sure they are doing their best to protect the Lebanese depositors who stands to lose the most. On the second and third duty, so defending the banking system and defending the Lebanese depositor, it wasn't very clear from the plan that the government is trying to do its best. What the government said is these are the losses, this is the haircut, these are the losses, and the banks are going to take those losses. Once we wipe out the equity, it's going to come to the depositors, and let's move on. And then I think what Alain clarified yesterday, which funnily wasn't that clear from previous discussions with the government or about the government plan, is actually the depositor will not lose a lot, because that 35 or 40 billion of losses that will end up with the depositor, which is huge, by the way, huge, but by standards, especially when you talk about your own Lebanese citizen depositors. What he said is actually the depositors are only going to end up with 3 to 5 billion, because the rest we're going to recover it from profits made in the past and interest which was made in the past by some large depositors, and from money that moved abroad.
Is this feasible, Adel? Is this feasible?
Precisely. I think this is where I criticize the government's plan. They are coming with losses. They're saying these are the losses, equity wiped out, fine, but a problem when you wipe out all the equity of banks. But beyond that, they're saying 40 billion or so of losses on the depositors. That's huge. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of families, life savings, which are going to be dramatically or drastically affected. A social and economic problem. So then what Alain explained yesterday is actually, no, hold on, it's not 40 billion, because out of that, we're going to recover, I think, 30 billion from interest paid that we should get back, excessive interest from growth. Yeah. But what's the guarantee that they're going to do this, and how soon and how fast? And in the meantime, we are basically taking the losses now and hitting all depositors and promising them effectively a recovery once we recover that money. So for me, that's a big flaw in the government's plan, what we call the kitchen sink approach. Let's take all the losses now and move on. If the government was only a borrower, I would understand that position. But they are responsible also for the depositor, the Lebanese depositor, and for safeguarding the banking system. I go to the bank's plan. Unfortunately, that plan also is a bit selfish and reflects some denial. And I have a lot of friends also in the banking system, and I told them the same. That plan doesn't stand, in my opinion, from a fundamental financial perspective. The banks are saying, well, hold on, let's not take any losses now, or let's take very minimal losses now, and let's wait because we can recover those losses. Let's grab the assets of the state and put them in a fund to cover for those losses in the future. I mean, this is, frankly, from a financial perspective, like unacceptable. The debt that the banks hold is unsecured debt. You cannot all of a sudden grab as collateral all the government's asset and say, now I'm actually guaranteeing my debt with those assets. That's one. It doesn't work like this in any system. Two, you cannot just like postpone the losses, because then we're going to end up in what we call zombie banks, banks that actually have losses that are not acknowledged, therefore balance sheets that are not clean or not transparent. You can't raise money. No investor will put money in those banks, and they need capital, and no depositor will actually put money in those banks if the balance sheets are not clean. And three, from a bank's perspective, so one, as I said, they want to take collateral over the government's asset or the state's assets, which belong to the whole population, not just to creditors. That's one. Two, they basically are keeping their balance sheets opaque, or they're not cleaning up their balance sheet and postponing the problem, which actually means banks will not be able to attract capital or deposits. And the third problem in the bank's plan, in my opinion, is they're saying, in the meantime, Mr. Depositor, we can give you back your money. It's there. Whenever we recover those losses the way we just described, in 5 and 6 deposits. So in both plans, effectively, to be honest, I think the depositor is buying promises or wishful thinking. The government's plan is promising him recovery of money that will come to reduce his losses. And the bank's plan is promising this depositor sale of assets and improvement in the situation and return of confidence to pay him back his money. Both, I think, are unrealistic. That's why I've been promoting a compromise. Not easy, clearly, not easy, because I go back to your question, what are the losses? The losses are huge. They're there. We know them, okay? The discussion is how to distribute those losses.
But who is the closest? بالlosses, we saw that the IMF was favoring the government plan. Basically, they said that they would want to go with the government plan, and I'm hearing even إنه عم بيحكوا إنه أرقام IMF are even higher than the losses proposed by the government plan.
I'm going to tell you something. The IMF is not neutral in this process, okay? In this process, you have three key stakeholders. You have the government, the borrower. His interest as the borrower is to reduce as much as possible future liabilities, so maximize haircuts, say, okay, I'm only going to pay you 25% of what I owe you. That's all I can do. Let's move on. Then you have the lenders or the creditors, mostly the banks, and behind them, the depositors, effectively, who actually want to minimize haircut or at least get promises that they can recover this money at some stage, one way or the other. And I'm oversimplifying, I know. And the third stakeholder is the IMF. The IMF is coming and saying, okay, I'm going to lend you a lot of money so you can restructure. I need you to have to reduce your debt to GDP. I need you to take as much losses as possible and pass them on to whoever is there, i.e. the creditors, because if I come to lend you, I want actually the least risk possible and the cleanest situation possible. So using the IMF as an argument, I think is a bit, they're not neutral in this process. Usually what happens, and that's the government's fault as well, in my opinion, but also the banks, you first clean up your house. You agree, you have the biggest stakeholders or the biggest creditors are the Lebanese banks. The first step is to sit down, should have been to sit down with the Lebanese bank and see if they can reach a compromise so we can show a unified front to the IMF. We don't go to the negotiating table arguing with each other and using the IMF as an ally. Because at the end of the day, we are negotiating with the IMF. They're going to come and give us money. they're going to put conditions that are harsh, and we're going to try to get a better outcome because, as I said, we're trying to protect our banking system and we're trying to protect our depositors. This is what makes our situation different from other countries. In other countries, IMF and the government are aligned because they both want to reduce as much as possible future liability and put the loss on the creditors. But in Lebanon, the creditors are Lebanese citizens and Lebanese banks, and that makes a huge difference. So yes, the IMF will say, I prefer the losses of the government. I actually think the losses of the government are reasonable, but let's break down those losses. Where are they coming from? The government saying, okay, I owe you 90 billion, okay, to all creditors, including Lebanese banks and central bank. I'm going to pay you 25% of that. That's how a big part of those losses coming from, okay? Well, 25% of that is what the government is proposing. But the creditors may say, no, I want you to pay me 50%. And then the losses become different. So the government cannot dictate the losses as basically a given. This is a negotiation. The haircut is a negotiation between creditors and the borrower. That's one. The second loss is coming from the loss of BDL. Same thing. The government who owns BDL ultimately is saying, well, BDL has taken a lot of losses. I'm not going to help them. I'm not going to basically improve the situation. That's the haircut on the BDL debt that is owed to the banks, and that's it. Again, that's not something the government can dictate. There should be a negotiation. So the talk about the losses are known and agreed with everyone. I think there's a bit of here, they're playing cute. No, the losses should be negotiated because the haircut, which is behind the losses, should be negotiated. And the third origin of losses is the losses in the NPLs, i.e. the loans to the commercial banks. Here, the banks and the government should discuss, because the banks know exactly, and the Commission of Control of Banks know exactly what are those losses made of, what's the collateral. So the government cannot come and say, well, these are the losses without going into deep details about what's the collateral, the guarantee against those loans, and whether those losses are accurate. So on three items, which is all the losses are about, I mean, again, if you look at the figures, that's it. Government bonds and T-bills, debt with BDL, and NPLs. I think the losses need to be discussed and agreed. It's not just a dicta, as we say, like the government come and say, this is what I pay you, done, and these are the losses.
Okay. So basically solve our problems internally and then go to the IMF with a unified number and a unified after how to نوزع الخسائر is our own issue. يعني هن المين problem تبعهم basically is توزيع الخسائر إذا بدنا نحكي فيها.
Once we agree the losses, and again, if you agree the haircut, you agree the losses. But agreeing the haircut, as I said, is a negotiation. And yes, the IMF wants as big of a haircut as possible to reduce future liability, but we need to go to the IMF and say, listen, the bigger the haircut, the more the losses on our citizens and depositors, so you have to give us a bit of leeway. And I'm not saying it's easy, but should be the natural position. And to reach that, as you say, we should have at least reached some sort of compromise or discussed internally, and maybe it wouldn't have worked, but at least try to discuss internally, not come up with a plan, come up with losses, come up with everything, and then we're surprised the creditors, i.e. the banks, and behind them the depositors are crying foul. Again, I'm not defending the banks, because I think on the other hand, the banks have been very disappointing by coming up with a plan which is very selfish and also flawed from a fundamental perspective. I really think both sides had missed the opportunity to reach a fair and equitable and rigorous or scientific compromise.
What to do today?
Because now we're 3 months into the negotiation, we're still arguing among each other.
What to do today? What should they do today?
As I said, I think they should try to reach a compromise, and they should clarify. The most important thing is to clarify. I'm not worried about shareholders. Shareholders in any capitalistic system, if there are losses, will take the loss. But I think they should clarify what happens to depositors. Alain yesterday said, well, depositors only lose 5 billion. But that wasn't clear from the government's plan. And if it's based on wishful thinking, we need to find a way to mitigate that.
But Alain was saying, he was saying that he wants to claw back the interest, as you said, and the money that was transferred abroad. But again, you said it yourself, bringing back money from abroad and interest, etc., would take a lot of time, and we lack time today.
Yes,
Right?
and this is where I want to mention what I propose about the reform. What I propose is precisely the problem we have is the following. I mean, fundamentally, what happened, the banks have turned their business into a large fixed income portfolio that lends to one single borrower, which is the government slash BDL.
Okay.
That was a huge mistake. Okay, in banking, you diversify your portfolio. You don't lend 75% of your assets to one risk, knowing that that risk is extremely, that credit the borrower is extremely risky. So banking in Lebanon has become two parts, effectively. One part, which is the usual traditional commercial banking, lending to companies and to retail and credit cards and real estate and businesses. And the second part has become 75% of the banking activity became just investing in government debt, to the extent that banking became just a huge fixed income portfolio. This is the heart of the problem. So how do we solve it, in my opinion, today? We split them. We really spin off the portfolio that the banks hold in sovereign debt, and that's where the problem is, and that's where the discussion about losses is, and that's where there's disagreement about what are the extent of the losses and where do we take them now or later. And by splitting the problem, we actually can solve them separately. Why? If I basically spin off the commercial banking portfolio, that 25%, which is the usual traditional commercial banking activity, that activity is very important for the country and for the economy. If I spin it off and I clean it, because it's just loans to the private sector, which is easy to, relatively easy to clean up, or at least to evaluate, then I have a new banking sector, which is 25% of the old banking sector, which is a size proportionate to the size of the economy, that I can recapitalize with fresh money and restart banking, because we need banking to restart. We can't just stay with zombie banks or a zombie banking system. While the other side, the 75%, which is where the problem is, where the losses are, and where the question mark about what are the losses are, this part, rather than keep arguing about it forever, I take it off balance sheet. I move it outside banks and deal with it separately. Because by moving it outside banks, I don't need anymore to agree now on valuation and clean up. I can actually have more time to negotiation, and I don't need to raise capital in that portion immediately. So that methodology I'm proposing is an efficient way to restart banking, to have banking come back to play its role, recover its role as an engine for economic growth, because it's much needed. And where we have arguments and problem and huge losses, we move it outside bank, outside the balance sheet of banks, into a vehicle that we work out over time. That's what I propose. It's a very practical way to split the problem in order to avoid getting stuck. Now, what happened to that portfolio? Because we need to know what happened. Obviously, deposits will have to be split accordingly. So 25% of the deposit will go into the commercial side, and 75% will stay in the sovereign portfolio. We have to do that, and same for the equity. Then what we do is, now 75% of the deposit own directly that portfolio of sovereign debt. So they become a direct creditor to the sovereign, and that's where the negotiations will happen, and we'll see how much we can recover. If what Alain's saying is true, that they can recover 30 billion out of money and interest that was moved abroad and benefit and dividends, that's great. That goes back to pay those depositors. If we can recover other losses, or maybe sell some assets, that part of it can go for those, for repaying of that debt, again, that's great. We can work that over time and improve the situation of those depositors who have taken the losses. My view is this is the only way to move on. Otherwise, we're going to remain stuck in arguments over losses, and it's very difficult to impose those large losses on the population immediately. As I said, a lot of people, if you ask them, they say, listen, I'm willing to wait, but don't haircut me immediately. And then you tell me, as soon as I recover some money from abroad, I'm going to pay it back to you. I think that's a bit.
So basically, Adel, you're saying, you're splitting into good banks, bad banks. That's that exactly. And now I have a good question here. Someone's asking you, how will you capitalize the new banks? Where will the money come from?
My view, again, I'm not saying this is a magic solution that will solve everything, but it's much easier. We need to capitalize the banks. It's much easier to capitalize that 25% of commercial banking activity than to capitalize everything, including a sovereign debt where the losses are huge and are not even agreed. So I'm not saying automatically capital will come to that good bank or to the commercial side, but I think it's much easier to capitalize that because once we've cleaned the balance sheet, it's a proper banking sector that has a very diversified portfolio in the economy. And I think we could attract fresh money definitely much easier this way than to keep banks as one single entity with 75% of that being sovereign debt with huge losses in it. So my answer is hopefully we're simplifying the problem, raising capital much easier, and we'll bring it then from international investors or basically from the diaspora, for example, so fresh money, or maybe even existing shareholders can bring back money into this as long as it's fresh money, because that's what we need to jumpstart the economy and banking.
Okay, thank you for elaborating your plan, Adel. Very interesting point. And I've read this plan. You talked about it 2 months ago.
Talking about it, honest, I don't call it a plan as much as I call it a roadmap. It's a methodology. Let's split the problem in two. One of them is easier to solve. And if we solve it, the commercial banking side, then we really jumpstart banking and economic growth and can have a hope for recovery. And the second is more difficult to solve. So let's put it aside, move it outside the balance sheet, and try to solve it in a consensual way. But at least it's not going to be a drag on the banking activity that we need to jumpstart.
But did the government listen to your plan, to your ideas, or no one listened to it?
But to be honest, I'm not in government anymore, and I'm not really in touch, to be honest, except with just casual discussions. So I don't know exactly where they stand. I think they're aware of it, and so is ABL. I think, as I said, it's a methodology that may make things much easier to solve, or at least can put us on the right track. But so far, I'm not involved in any serious discussion about that.
Okay, today, Adel, confidence in the banking system has vanished completely. So واليوم شفنا إنه government, we have mainly our problem in Lebanon is a confidence problem. So do you think today that the government reflects confidence right now?
Listen, I mean, again, I want to stay away from politics, but there's no question that this government has been extremely disappointing. I mean, at the end of the day, all we need is to look at the level of the Lebanese lira, which is a reflection of the confidence and of the economy, to see that it's extremely disappointing that after 4 months, I can't point to any meaningful reform or decision that was taken that has had a positive impact. At the end of the day, we're in a crisis situation of incredible magnitude. So what you expect from a government in this situation is come in, roll up their sleeves, and start making decisions that have direct positive impact. Unfortunately, I don't think it's the case. I don't think anyone can argue that we've seen meaningful reforms or decisions or execution. What we've seen is a plan, and it's great to have a plan, but honestly, a plan, again, is a medium-term thing. And even that plan is now kind of a bit in limbo, i.e. there's back and forth discussions. It's way below the expectations of the population, and honestly, way below the challenges that we face today. We need the government to step up, make radical reforms and decisions, and some of them are ready or available and known. We know. I mean, think only about a very simple example, which is the appointment in the financial sector. We had vacancies in the financial appointments at the time where we're going through a major crisis, unprecedented crisis. We had major vacancies in key positions. It took 3.5 months, I think, to appoint people in those positions. And the process of appointment was the same type of process and political bickering and negotiation between politicians that has actually crippled all previous government, including the one I was part of. So you would expect from this government, and in time of crisis, a new style or a new type of a new style in addressing those basic issues. You come within a week, you make appointments, picking the most competent, irrespective of political allegiance. This is not what happened. It took us 3.5 months, and same thing with the IMF plan or with any other thing. We're still basically, everything is stalling. It's unacceptable in times of crisis.
Adel, now I want to go to the point of the IMF. I want to discuss a bit the IMF. أنت حكيت كذا مرة على تويتر إنه the IMF is the only way out today. Can you explain why? There is no plan B.
Okay, I mean, again, I want to keep it very simple, and let's again be realistic and avoid wishful thinking or dreams, because at the end of the day, we're really in a difficult situation. We need capital from outside. The capital inflow into the country reached a sudden stop sometime in the summer to fall of 2019. And therefore, our balance of payment now is suffering. We cannot go on. Why do we need capital from outside? Because we have essential imports that we need to import to bring into the country and pay for, okay? We obviously have government requirements also in dollar, and we need to also provide for a social safety net for the most vulnerable, because the poverty rate has reached unprecedented levels. So we need that capital from outside. We cannot only rely on local money. And that capital from outside, where are we going to get it? If someone can have any example or an option other than the IMF, I'd be very happy to hear that. But I think in crisis situation like this, the only source of capital from outside, and every country in the world said it, they will not provide direct funding to the government except if there is an IMF program and an IMF process. That's the reality. So either we take that capital from outside, negotiate, and it usually comes in the form of direct help to the government to support the Lebanese pound, support the reserve, support essential imports, and support social safety net. And usually it comes in the form of long-term debt at subsidized rate. This is what is on the table. This is what every country in crisis asked for, including, as we've seen around us, countries like Greece or Cyprus or other countries in recent times. So even Greece, which is part of the European Union, they went for the IMF. And even the European Union itself said, we will only help if there is an IMF program. So this is what I'm saying. I'm not fond of the IMF, but I don't see any other option for that type of immediate requirement.
But some are talking about, you know, إذا بنروح على الشرق أو على الغرب, يعني going west or going east.
And yet, sorry, finish your question.
Yeah, some people are talking, you know, we can go east. We don't need the IMF. China can come and can help us and support us. What's your stance on that?
I think we shouldn't mix with two different needs. The first need, as I said, is fresh dollars from outside immediately to support our urgent requirements. And this is a need or a funding at the government level, comes directly in the form of long-term subsidized loans that will support those urgent needs. That's one requirement, which is immediate and urgent. And the more we delay it, the more we're going to see a drop in the Lebanese pound. By definition, if you don't have supply of dollars, then the Lebanese pound will continue to drop because there is much more demand than supply. That need, again, I don't think China or any other country is willing to provide it. It's only the IMF right now, as far as I know. The second need, which we have, is clearly investment in infrastructure projects. This is what Sadr was supposed to do, i.e. investment in projects that are needed from an infrastructure perspective, but also that will jumpstart the economy, create economic activity and jobs creation in all sectors, waste, energy, electricity, transportation. We all know the list of infrastructure needs. That second need that we have can come from Chinese companies or European companies or any other companies. There are many companies who are interested, and I think we should welcome definitely companies coming from China, the same way we would welcome companies coming from other parts of the world, as long as their conditions are acceptable or transparent. So that second need, I don't have any problem with going east or west. We should just basically have a transparent process. Companies will bid and we will select the best offer. And I think that's what where the Chinese company, just like other companies, which should be welcome because we need to diversify the source of investment. But this need doesn't make up for our first need, which is direct funding to support our balance of payment and support and provide supply of dollars to the market.
So to recap, you are mainly telling us that you support getting some help from China, but this doesn't cancel the fact that we need the IMF loan urgently today because we need external funding at the moment, right?
Exactly. I think the short-term need for funding, we needed yesterday. I mean, usually countries go to the IMF immediately and negotiate immediately at least a line or a credit line or an emergency line, as I said, to support their essential needs. We need that funding as soon as possible, and we need to focus on that. Separately, as I say, infrastructure projects, as soon as they're ready, we want companies to come from anywhere in the world, including China. It's a big economy.
Okay, Adel, كمان I have a question. إنه صاروا on several occasions عم بيقولوا لنا إنه negotiation with the IMF is positive. Yet we saw during the weekend the IMF managing director who said clearly that there was still no sign of a breakthrough with the IMF. So where do we stand? Can you tell us where do we stand with the IMF negotiations today?
I think again we have to be realistic and honest with ourselves. As far as I see, we stand nowhere. We have a plan that we're still arguing among each other about this plan. We haven't agreed about this plan. There were even arguments, as we know, inside the negotiation that the IMF attended. That doesn't look great. I mean, we're in a major crisis. You don't walk into the IMF negotiation room arguing among each other and not sure about the plan and backtracking. And I think this is where we are today. It's obvious that we're stalling, and it's obvious that the IMF, I think the IMF director said it breaks her heart that we're not progressing. I mean, it also breaks our heart because every day that passes by, we're losing time and the situation is deteriorating. And let's not forget that at the end of the day, the citizen, the Lebanese citizen, is paying a very heavy price for those delays.
Yes, also they are talking that we are not doing any reforms. So basically also that's why they're seeing no development on our side and no reform, no clear plan, no consensus on the numbers. All this is making the IMF negotiations stalling at the moment. I agree.
Well, there's something here, actually, you raised a very important point, which I wanted to stress. Usually you negotiate with the IMF, but at the same time, and this is what I mentioned earlier, you start with major radical decisions that are priorities that show a sign that actually are confidence measure to show everyone, your citizen, but also the IMF and the creditors, that you're serious about reforms. Unfortunately, I cannot point to any decision or major reform that was taken in the last 3 months. It's not enough to have a plan. In parallel, we have to implement serious reforms, and some of them are known and almost ready. And I can give you a list of 5 to 10 reforms that were obvious, that need to be taken, and that are still not implemented or even taken. Or some of them actually were floated and then they withdrew it, such like as the capital control law. I mean, for me, it's unacceptable, a country going through such a crisis. We have effectively a capital control, but we don't have a law that protects small depositors from this capital control situation. And we actually have arbitrary capital control implemented by banks on a case-by-case basis. That is not acceptable by any standards. The government itself said they're going to have a law. We're 8 months into the crisis, and we still don't have a capital control law. That's an obvious reform to execute from day one. Other reforms like electricity, like appointments, as I said, like some of the major laws, all this is missing. So usually you preempt the negotiation with the IMF. Before you go to the negotiation, you already take some radical reforms and confidence measures. One, you help your citizen and you help confidence, and you may be able to stop a bit the collapse in the Lebanese pound. But two, you show the international community and you show the creditors that you're actually serious. You don't wait for the negotiation to start the reforms. Most of those reforms, we've known about them for years. This is what is unfortunate. There's no change in a system. We're not seeing any change right now. The system is still the same, trying to delay and postpone reforms, trying to stall and that doesn't work in times of crisis.
If today, let's say, we don't reach a deal with the IMF, we've seen the Lebanese pound reaching unbearable levels. Yani. We've seen it rising above 8,000 today in the black market. How worse can it get if we don't reach an agreement with the IMF?
Honestly, it's very difficult to say, but it's very difficult to say because, you know, this can continue to drop. The only thing that, I mean, the Lebanese, the exchange rate is driven by supply and demand. And how do you influence supply and demand? You bring in more supply from outside. So that's what the IMF or tourism can bring in. But mostly that's why we need a quick line, because we need quick supply. And demand, today, every Lebanese citizen, as soon as he has Lebanese pound, is going to convert them into dollar because he has zero confidence. And this is where you need confidence measure. To reduce the demand, you also need to stop smuggling. You need to stop capital going outside the country. So all these measures will reduce demand, and capital from outside will increase supply. We're not doing neither. And if we continue like this, I don't know where the exchange rate is going to go, because you have more demand and less supply. And the idea of asking the central bank to use its reserves to block or to fix the exchange rate at some artificial level, I mean, this is the game they tried for years, and that's why we're paying today a heavy price. So we cannot keep using reserves. I mean, it's a very simple equation. The more reserves you use to stop the collapse in the Lebanese pound, the bigger the hole is in the depositors' money. I mean, it's automatic. The depositors, the reserves are actually depositors' money at the central bank. The more you use of that, the more you're going to actually create permanent losses in depositors' money to probably affect a very temporary effect on the exchange rate. So that's not a solution. The real solution is to bring in supply from outside and to reduce the demand. And on both sides, I don't see much action.
Actually, we've seen the reverse. We've seen news like the circular 151 circular. Someone is saying on the page, stop 151 circular. We saw that this week you could take your USDs from the bank instead of 3,000 at 3,800 3,850. Do you think this was a good thing, or it is bad because you will be printing more liras, thus creating more inflation?
I mean, these are catch-up solutions that will not, I mean, effectively, all they're doing here is a disguised haircut on deposits. So if you have your money in the bank, now that the dollar rate in the black market is around 8,000, they've adjusted from 3,000 to 3,800. But you still, as a depositor, once you convert into lira, your dollar is actually being haircut by almost 45 or 50%. That is not the solution. I don't think this is basically disguised or progressive lirification.
They are worsening the situation because they are printing more liras, basically.
Well,
no?
that's, as soon as this depositor is getting his lira at 3,850, he's worried that it's going to get worse with the lira. So he's going to go and buy dollar at 8,000. He is taking the hit, but he's going to go and provide more demand for dollars. That's not a solution, unfortunately. It's just progressive lirification, which is practically hitting the depositors with a heavy haircut.
Yes, hitting everyone basically with a heavy haircut. Also, I wanted to ask you, Adel, about the subsidy, the fuel subsidy. A lot of economists, from Dan Azzi to Nasser Asaidi, we've heard them all talking about removing the subsidy on fuel. Do you think this would help on the short term, or could be a solution to control the exchange rate?
Honestly, I don't have the exact figures. But conceptually, I think this is not the right time to reduce subsidies. They want to reduce subsidies to stop smuggling effectively, to reduce arbitrage. Well, you don't stop, like if you want to stop smuggling, you just put people at the border to stop smuggling. You don't reduce subsidies basically hitting people who are benefiting from subsidies. So fundamentally, I don't think that's the right solution to stop the smuggling. there is now a very high rate of poverty, and I feel very uncomfortable in this environment to reduce subsidies because the government is failing at its role in preventing smuggling.
But you know, he's right. Finance gurus is giving the number 4 to 5 billion USD per year spending on fuel. So if you remove the subsidy on it, it would have a big effect on the exchange rate also, not only on the smuggling.
Correct. But separately, again, that's $4 to $5 billion that will be paid by those who need those goods. Again, can they afford that? What is the alternative? Do we have public transport, for example?
Coupons. They were talking about distributing coupons to the most vulnerable families.
Good idea, but I'm very worried about the current state with all the corruption and the clientelism being given the power to distribute coupons to the citizen. I mean, you can imagine all the abuse that this can lead to. So, I mean, to be honest, I haven't looked at the numbers in details, but conceptually, I'm worried about hitting the poorer by removing subsidies simply because we cannot tackle the issue of smuggling. And the second issue is if we make up for that with coupons, I'm very worried about the abuse that can come from the distribution of coupons and who will benefit from that. If we were in a different environment, I would say it may be a good idea. But right now, I think if we want to stop smuggling, we just have to protect our borders. That's, in my opinion, the most straightforward solution.
Yes, could be. Adel Kamina, another question that I receive often on the page. Do you think the exchange houses are manipulating the exchange rate, or is it just supply and demand?
There's no doubt, again, in a thin market where you don't have a lot of supply, it's very easy to manipulate the market, and clearly there's some speculation. But I don't think that's the fundamental reason for the drop in the Lebanese pound. The supply and demand mechanics are very bad. We all know it. Everyone is trying to, everyone who has Lebanese pound is trying to go and get a dollar to protect the value of his money, and there's not enough supply. But as a result of a thin market and poor liquidity and little supply, clearly prices can jump, and maybe one or two sellers can actually manipulate the market to some extent. We see this in every market. Unfortunately, the problem is the lack of supply, and yes, there could be abuse because there is a lack of supply.
Okay. هلا اليوم انه الليبانيز people مثل ما قلنا يعني الحد الادنى للاجور صار $80, below $80, which is crazy. A lot of people are better off staying at home than going to work, and their salaries are almost worth nothing, and paying the fuel is expensive, more expensive for them. So if we don't reach today an IMF agreement, where can the exchange rate go?
Again, that's honestly the 20,000 lira question. I really don't know. It's very difficult to predict, but we've seen other countries where, I mean, the collapse can continue and go on for a while.
Can we become like Venezuela? Can we become like Syria?
Why not? In the absence of external help, it's very difficult to predict how far the Lebanese pound will drop, in my opinion. Obviously, the economy will adjust and the consumer will adjust, so that we'll start consuming more locally, people will travel less, poverty will make people consume less.
That's realistic. When you say consume locally, a lot of products that are produced locally, the raw material is imported.
Yes, correct.
You're not self-sufficient, at least for the short term. In a lot of things, you're not self-sufficient. Let's not lie to each other. You know what I mean? You have to import a lot of things from the technology sector. Hello, we're going to talk about tech sector. We're not advanced enough. You are not you cannot rely on yourself. أنا هيدا مخاوفي. لوين رايحين؟ وين معقول نوصل اليوم؟
ما في شك إنه we will not be able to adjust very quickly because there is a lot of raw material that we need to import, and it's going to be expensive. And that's why I'm very pessimistic. Without support from outside, I'm pessimistic. I think it will take us a while to adjust. Obviously, the lack of tourism or the COVID-19 situation has made the situation even worse, because clearly we're also missing those inflow from people coming to the country, tourists or expats, and spending in the country. So we've been very unlucky with that as well. But again, the key driver, in my opinion, is to get support from outside, a few billions or like up to 10 billion staggered over a few years, deliver the reforms that are required so we can get back on the right track. Otherwise, it's going to be a very painful situation, there's no doubt. And we've seen it in other countries. Not easy to recover from this. We have the perfect storm. We have a banking crisis, we have a financial crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, and also political crisis, and obviously monetary crisis.
يعني اليوم حتى people are worried about medication, يعني the healthcare system, the education system, all of these sectors are collapsing today.
Yes,
يعني I am worried.
The subsidies are still coming from the central bank reserves, and again, that's really buying time, because, or actually that's kicking the can.
How much do we have with our reserves, Adel?
Sorry?
How much time with the current reserves? How much time can we still sustain without external help?
Well, it's a very theoretical question. The current reserves effectively are negative. Like what the central bank owes to the bank is much more than what they have in reserves. So in my, the more we use, the bigger the losses on banks, therefore on depositors. Effectively, we've already used the reserves and we're in negative territory. Now, the question, yes, we can keep digging into those reserves, therefore the hole is going to get bigger and we're going to have to sort it out separately, but that's another problem. So that's why, again, I go back to the same issue. Unless we get help, fresh money from outside, we're really digging deeper, and that's not good. And we've already wasted, in my opinion, a lot of time, at least 4 and maybe 8 months of a process that is stalling, where other countries, I mean, I read somewhere that the IMF has provided up to 85 billion of support in the last few months to countries who needed help. What are we doing in the meantime in Lebanon? Arguing over numbers and over plans. And what is sad is the polarization of the debate. Like, it's not even a scientific debate. It became personal, emotional, people driven by vested interests or political or personal agendas. So it became tense, where actually we should be working together to come up with a consensus plan to face the IMF and get what we need.
So today, basically, for you, it's more of a political problem than an economic problem?
I think we have a huge talent in Lebanon and abroad, Lebanese, who understand the economic problem and can actually help solve it. The problem is clearly the political system, ineffective, inept at making decisions, slow, no sense of urgency, and vested interest and political agendas that still drive a lot of the decisions or the non-decisions.
Yeah. Adel, I want you to stay with us, but because the live session stays for only 1 hour, I will have to close this conversation and restart it directly.
Sure.
Because, sorry, we're taking a lot of your time, by the way. Is it okay for a bit? Because I want to take some questions from everyone, from the public. And also, I still have few questions to address with you. Is it okay?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so everyone, I'm going to close this chat and open it again. So I'll leave time for all of your questions to ask your questions to Adel. And also, I still have few questions myself, and that's it. So stay tuned, waiting for you. Yalla, Adel, I'll contact you in 5.